Welcome to Mild History. If you're watching this, let me know where you're tuning in from, your bed, your couch, or maybe even on the move. Tonight, we're stepping quietly into the Middle Ages, into the world of the feast. Not the Hollywood version with endless meat and golden goblets, but the quieter, stranger reality that shaped how people lived, survived, and celebrated. When most of us hear the words medieval feast, our imagination fills in the same picture. A roaring fire, tables lined with roasted pigs, goblets brimming with wine, and lords and ladies laughing in velvet robes. It is an image that feels warm and familiar, one that movies, novels, and even fairs have painted for us over and over. But history often asks us to look past the familiar. Feasts in the Middle Ages were not everyday luxuries. They were rare, deliberate, carefully staged events. They were moments when food itself became more than sustenance, moments where survival and symbolism met, where scarcity and hierarchy coexisted with ritual and celebration. The very word feast comes from the Latin festa, meaning celebration. A feast was never just about eating. It was a pause in the ordinary rhythm of life. For the nobility, it was a stage to display wealth, generosity, and influence. For the poor, it was a reprieve, a chance to taste something just a little better than the coarse bread and thin pottage that filled most days. Yet for everyone, the feast was about more than appetite. It was about structure. It was about order. Much of what we believe about medieval feasts does not come from the Middle Ages at all. It comes from those who came later. The Victorians adored the Middle Ages. To them, it was a golden age of knights, chivalry, and tradition. They pictured tables overflowing with food, laughter without end, and abundance without scarcity. Their imagination shaped the way we still see the medieval world today. Hollywood picked up this vision and amplified it, filling the screen with endless platters, jewel-colored wines, and halls where food seemed to appear without end. But the sources from the period tell us something else. Illuminated manuscripts show feasts, but these were not meant as documentary snapshots. They were art. They were designed to flatter, to glorify patrons, to make kings and lords look powerful and pious. The Bayeux Tapestry, one of the most famous depictions of a medieval feast, shows William the Conqueror and his men dining after Hastings. But even that is not neutral. It is propaganda, carefully stitched to show victory and divine favor. And chroniclers like Jean Froissart, writing of magnificent 14th century feasts, wrote with performance in mind. His audience expected spectacle, so he gave them spectacle, hundreds of dishes, exotic spices, luxuries that most of Europe would never even taste. There is truth in these accounts, but they are truth seen through a lens of exaggeration and display. The reality was shaped by geography, trade, and religion. The Middle Ages lasted 1,000 years, and Europe was vast and varied. There was no single way to feast. In England, pork was common among peasants, while venison marked noble privilege. In France, wine was central, tied to the vineyards that dominated the countryside. In Italy, grains and early forms of pasta appeared on the table. In Spain and Portugal, olives and citrus fruits gave a Mediterranean character to dining. And in the far north, Scandinavia leaned heavily on fish, preserved and stored for long winters. Different regions had different resources, but across all of them, one thing remained constant. The feast was not about indulgence. It was about order. Behind the image of abundance lay a constant awareness of survival. Scarcity was always in the background. Harvests could fail. Winters could be harsh. Preservation was limited to salting, smoking, drying. Grain had to be carefully stored, meat spoiled quickly. Fish had to be salted for Lent and fasting days. A feast was as much about using what could be preserved as it was about showing what was fresh. Scarcity shaped abundance. And when a lord held a feast, it was not simple generosity. It was power. It was proof that he could provide when others could not. The Doomsday Book, compiled in 1086, shows us how resources underpin this system. Every cow, every sheep, every field was counted. Food was wealth, and wealth was power. To control food was to control people. A feast became a stage where that power could be seen, tasted, and remembered. Writers like Chaucer remind us that feasts could also be criticized. In the Canterbury Tales, characters like the monk and the friar reveal their corruption through their appetites. Food becomes a satire, a mirror for human weakness. Later centuries replaced satire with nostalgia. The Victorians longed for a simpler, more communal past, and modern reenactments and Renaissance fairs inherited much of that longing. When we picture oversized turkey legs and overflowing goblets, we are not really looking at the Middle Ages. We are looking at centuries of retelling, exaggeration, and imagination. And yet, the fascination remains. Because feasts were never just about food. They were performances. They were stages where wealth was displayed, generosity performed, hierarchy reinforced, and memory created. At their core, feasts were paradoxes. They were ordinary, grounded in the rhythms of hunger, scarcity, and survival. Yet they were extraordinary because in those rare moments, communities stepped out of daily struggle and into ritual. They carried the tension between reality and myth, between hunger and abundance, between generosity and strategy. And that is what makes them so compelling even now. The feast invites us to look closer, to look at food not as calories or comfort, but as culture and control. To see how bread could symbolize survival, how meat could mark privilege, how wine could seal alliances. To see how something as simple as a meal could become a mirror of an entire world. Wherever you are watching from right now, your bed, your couch, or on the move, remember this. The story of the medieval feast is not really about food at all. It is about people. It is about survival disguised as celebration. It is about myth, memory, and the way we keep retelling the past. And it is only the beginning of the story we are about to explore together. When we think of a medieval feast, the first image that comes to mind is the food itself. Endless roasts, platters stacked high, goblets filled to the brim. Yet if we look past the myth and turn to the reality, what people actually ate tells us far more about their world than the grandest banquet hall ever could. Because food, in the Middle Ages, was never just about taste. It was about survival, status, and the quiet rhythm of life lived close to the limits of scarcity. At the core of every meal, whether at a peasant's cottage or a noble's hall, were the grains. Cereal crops were the foundation of medieval diets. Barley, rye, oats, and in some regions wheat, formed the backbone of sustenance. Barley and rye were more common among the lower classes, baked into coarse, dark bread or boiled into pottage. Wheat, the finest grain, was a luxury. White bread made from pure wheat flour was reserved for the wealthy, a visible marker of privilege. Bread was so central that it wasn't only food, it became a symbol of social order itself. In many feasts, loaves were used as trenchers, flat pieces of bread serving as plates. By the end of a meal, these trenchers were soaked with meat juices and given to the poor or to the dogs, depending on the household. Even the scraps reinforced hierarchy. Vegetables were common but carried none of the glamour of meat. Cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips were staples. Beans and peas, dried for storage, provided much-needed protein. These were the foods of the common table, eaten daily, sustaining the body but rarely celebrated. Pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, was the most common dish for peasants, and sometimes the only dish. Day after day, season after season, the pot on the hearth simmered, with ingredients changing according to what was available. It was humble food, monotonous perhaps, but it was survival. Meat was rare, and that rarity made it powerful. For peasants, a taste of pork was a treat, often salted or smoked to last through the winter. Hunting laws kept venison and game firmly in the hands of the nobility. To eat venison was not just to eat well, it was to be reminded of privilege and restriction, of land ownership and law. Nobles dined on swan, peacock, and boar not only because they could, but because such foods displayed wealth and control. A roasted peacock, sometimes served with its feathers reattached for dramatic effect, was not only food but theater, a performance meant to awe the guests. Fish played a vital role, especially under the rules of the church. With Lent and numerous fast days throughout the year, meat was often forbidden, and fish became the acceptable alternative. Salted herring, dried cod, and freshwater fish like pike and eel made their way to the table. Coastal regions relied heavily on the sea, while inland communities preserved fish to carry them through the seasons. Wealthy households sometimes served sturgeon or elaborate fish pies, but even here, the purpose was not simply nourishment. It was about showing adherence to faith, and at the same time displaying access to trade and preservation. Dairy was less reliable. Without refrigeration, milk spoiled quickly. Butter and cheese lasted longer, but they varied greatly by region. In Northern Europe, butter was common. In the Mediterranean, olive oil often took its place. Honey was the main sweetener, prized and valuable, long before sugar became widespread. Spices, too, played a role in shaping perceptions of feasts. Imported from distant lands, they were expensive, rare, and often misunderstood. Contrary to popular myth, spices were not used primarily to cover spoiled food. Instead, they were luxuries, markers of wealth and reach. Cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and saffron signaled connections to far-off trade routes, and their use turned ordinary meals into displays of global influence. Yet beneath all this variety, food was still governed by scarcity. Famines struck regularly. A bad harvest could mean hunger for months. Preservation was vital. Meat was salted, fish dried, grains stored in granaries that were always vulnerable to pests and rot. Winters were long and unforgiving. For the wealthy, the feast was a chance to forget those realities, to eat as though scarcity did not exist. For the poor, even on a feast day, food was only a slight improvement from the ordinary, perhaps a bit more bread, a small portion of meat, or the rare sweetness of honey. The contrast between classes was stark. At the high table, nobles might dine on roasted meats, pies filled with spiced game, and delicate wafers. Servants and peasants at the edges of the same hall ate coarse bread, thick stew, and whatever scraps made their way down the hierarchy. This visual arrangement, from the head table down to the benches, reflected more than hunger. It reflected the entire structure of medieval society. Food distribution mirrored power. What you ate told everyone exactly who you were. Archaeological evidence reinforces this picture. Excavations at sites like Warham Percy, a deserted medieval village in England, reveal the remains of animal bones. The peasants ate mostly pork and mutton, often the cheaper cuts. The nobility's records, by contrast, list venison, beef, and game birds in abundance. Household rolls, which carefully recorded what was purchased and consumed, show in detail how feasts were supplied and managed. These documents are windows into the rhythms of kitchens and pantries, where every detail of food was tied to the rhythms of survival. Religion shaped eating in ways that went far beyond the menu. Feasting and fasting were tied to the church calendar. Certain days required abstinence from meat. Certain foods carried symbolic weight. Bread and wine echoed the rituals of communion. Fish symbolized faith and discipline. A feast was not just about filling the stomach. It was about displaying piety, obedience, and status all at once. If we think again about that popular image of the medieval feast, tables groaning with food, it's worth remembering that this was not the everyday reality. For most, food was simple, repetitive, and precarious. Grains boiled into pottage, bread baked from barley or rye, a few vegetables from the garden. Meat, when available, was stretched as far as it could go. Even in noble households, abundance came at a cost: days of preparation, immense labor, and careful management of resources. Feasting was not constant. It was episodic, tied to holidays, victories, or marriages. And when it happened, it carried weight far beyond taste. To sit at a table in the Middle Ages was to take part in a system. The food in front of you was never neutral. It spoke of where you lived, what resources you had, how close you were to power. It reminded you of the risks of hunger and the reality of survival. It connected you to faith, to land, to season, and to the structures of society. And it reminded you that in a world always shadowed by scarcity, the act of feasting was both rare and profound. So the next time you picture a medieval feast, look past the platters of meat and the golden goblets. Imagine instead the grains at the core of every meal, the pottage simmering endlessly on a hearth, the bread that served as both plate and symbol. Imagine the hierarchy built into every portion, the survival hidden in every salted cut of meat or dried fish. A feast was never just food. It was an expression of who you were, what you believed, and how the world around you worked. And in that sense, the story of the food itself is not only about taste. It is about meaning. It is about how a society understood itself, one meal at a time. To picture the medieval feast properly, we need to step inside the space itself, to imagine the setting, the atmosphere, and the details that surrounded the food. Because the meal was never just about what was on the table. It was about where the table stood, who sat around it, and what the hall looked like once the candles were lit and the guests arrived. And if we look closely, we find that the feast was not always as glamorous or clean as modern retellings would suggest. The medieval hall was the heart of feasting. In castles, manor houses, and even in some town guild halls, the great hall functioned as a space for dining, for gathering, and for displaying status. These halls were large, open rooms with high ceilings, wooden beams, and long trestle tables. At one end, usually raised on a dais, stood the high table. This was where the lord, his family, and honored guests sat. From this elevated position, they could look out over the rest of the hall, a literal and symbolic reminder of their authority. Below them stretched the long rows of tables for retainers, guests of lower rank, and servants who were permitted to sit. Seating, as much as food, displayed hierarchy. Where you sat told the room exactly who you were. The furnishings themselves were temporary. Tables were often trestles, wooden boards placed across supports, taken down after the meal. Benches served as seating, though the high table might be reserved for chairs with backs, another subtle sign of privilege. The hall was multipurpose, used for gatherings, for justice, and even for sleeping, so dining arrangements were designed to be assembled and disassembled. The transformation of the hall into a feast space was itself a performance, one that required planning and labor. The lighting was dim. Candles and torches provided illumination, but they cast more shadow than clarity. At night, a feast hall was a place of flickering light, of shadows moving across stone or wooden walls, of smoke from torches and hearths filling the air. The smell of food mingled with the smell of tallow candles, rushes, and the bodies of many people crowded together. It was atmospheric, but it was also heavy, smoky, and sometimes unpleasant. The floors were often strewn with rushes, reeds, or straw, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or thyme to freshen the air. Over time, these rushes absorbed spills of food, drink, and worse, until they were replaced. Hygiene was relative, and the feast hall reflected this. Dogs sometimes roamed the edges of the room, snapping at scraps or bones. Servants hurried between tables, carrying dishes, pouring wine or ale, cleaning up where they could. The setting was grand compared to a peasant's cottage, but it was still messy, noisy, and crowded. As for personal hygiene, it was carefully managed through ritual. Guests washed their hands before meals, often at basins placed near the entrance to the hall. This was not just about cleanliness, but about ritual and courtesy. To eat with dirty hands was to break etiquette, and etiquette mattered. During the feast itself, manners were closely observed. People shared dishes, often dipping bread into common bowls, so washing beforehand was essential. Napkins were not individual but communal, shared along the table. Forks were rare until later centuries, so most people ate with knives, spoons, and their hands, guided by rules of politeness that prescribed how to cut, how to dip, and how to avoid taking more than one's share. The sensory experience of the feast was layered. The sound of minstrels or singers filled the hall, competing with the clatter of knives and cups, the laughter of guests, the barking of dogs. The sight of platters being carried in, sometimes in dramatic procession, added to the sense of ceremony. The smells of roasted meat, baked bread, and spiced dishes mixed with smoke and sweat. To modern sensibilities, the environment might feel overwhelming. To medieval diners, it was both ordinary and extraordinary, the moment when daily life was transformed into ritual. Servants were everywhere, though rarely noticed in the records. They were the invisible infrastructure of the feast, carrying dishes, pouring drinks, managing waste, and maintaining the rhythm of the event. Many were young boys, learning their place in the household through service. Others were skilled cooks and stewards, whose knowledge of food preservation, preparation, and presentation made the feast possible. Behind the scenes, the kitchen was a world of fire, smoke, noise, and sweat, far removed from the refined image of the dining hall. It was here that animals were butchered, dough kneaded, spices measured, and dishes prepared in numbers that could feed dozens or even hundreds of people. Yet even with all this planning and labor, the feast was not a picture of sterility. Illness was common, and the risk of contaminated food or drink was ever present. Water was rarely trusted, so ale and wine were the standard beverages, safer because of the brewing and fermentation processes. Still, the feast was a place where germs spread easily, where the closeness of bodies and the sharing of dishes created conditions ripe for sickness. Guests were aware of this, though they did not understand disease in modern terms. They relied instead on ritual washing, on the cleansing scent of herbs strewn on the floor, and on the symbolic order of the meal itself to bring a sense of safety. The setting of the feast was, in its own way, a microcosm of medieval life. Hierarchy was everywhere, from the raised dais of the Lord's table to the rough benches of the lower guests. Ritual surrounded every act, from hand-washing to carving meat. The hall was both a stage and a shelter, both a place of performance and a reminder of the limits of comfort. It was grand, yes, but it was also messy, smoky, and imperfect. To understand the medieval feast, we must hold these two realities together. It was at once magnificent and uncomfortable, impressive and precarious. The great hall shimmered with candlelight, echoed with music and laughter, and displayed wealth and power. But it also reeked of smoke, rang with noise, and carried the risks of illness and disorder. It was in this tension between grandeur and grit that the medieval feast unfolded, night after night, across centuries. And it is in that very tension that the setting itself becomes part of the story. Not just the food, not just the guests, but the hall, the flicker of light, the smell of herbs on the rushes, the creak of benches, the echo of voices rising into the rafters. This was the world of the medieval feast, not polished, not sanitized, but real, layered, and deeply human. One of the clearest ways to understand a medieval feast is to watch where people sat. Seating was not accidental. It was not about comfort or convenience. It was about structure, ritual, and power. In fact, the arrangement of bodies around the table may have spoken louder than the food itself, for it was here that hierarchy was displayed most clearly, and here that guests were reminded of their place in the world. At the center of it all was the high table. Raised on a dais, often at one end of the hall, it commanded attention. Here sat the lord of the manor, his family, and the most honored guests. From this vantage point, they could look out across the room, literally above those who dined below. The high table was often covered with a finer cloth, decorated with candles or plate, and served with the choicest dishes. Those who sat here were not only eating, they were performing status, visible to everyone else. To be invited to the high table was an honor. To be excluded was a reminder of rank. Below the dais stretched the trestle tables of the hall. These long rows seated guests of lesser rank, retainers, visiting merchants, or local figures. Seating along these tables was not random. The closer one sat to the high table, the higher ones standing. The further down the row, the lower one's rank. Proximity mattered. Every seat carried meaning, and everyone present understood it. Even the arrangement of servants and stewards, bustling to and from, reinforced the structure of authority. For peasants and the poor, feasts held by nobles might allow a place at the very end of these rows, or on benches set up along the sides of the hall. Their portions were smaller, the food less fine, and their access limited. Yet even being present carried meaning. To share in the Lord's bounty, however modestly, reinforced loyalty and dependency. For those excluded entirely, food might still reach them in the form of leftovers, trenchers of bread, or alms distributed afterward. Even scraps carried symbolism, reminders of generosity flowing downward through the ranks. Etiquette at the table reflected hierarchy as well. The right to carve meat was reserved for skilled carvers, often young nobles trained in the art. Carving was a performance, done with elegance and precision, watched by the hall. Drinking, too, carried rules. The lord might raise a cup, and others would follow. Toasts reinforced bonds, and the order of drinking reflected rank. Even gestures of courtesy, like offering a dish, were charged with meaning. To pass food to someone of higher rank was improper. To receive it from them was an honor. Seating also reflected gender. In many feasts, men dominated the high table, with women present but less prominent. Noble women might sit beside their husbands, but they did not always command attention in the same way. In monastic or guild feasts, seating reflected profession or office, further emphasizing structure over individuality. The architecture of the hall reinforced these divisions. The raised dais was not just a platform, but a symbol, a physical elevation of status. The arrangement of benches along trestles created long lines of sight toward the Lord, focusing attention on him as the center of the feast. The spatial order mirrored the social order. The feast hall was a diagram of medieval society, with its rigid hierarchies, its visible structures, and its careful rituals. Even the food followed these lines. The choicest cuts and spiced dishes were reserved for the high table. Dishes might be presented first to the Lord before being distributed elsewhere. By the time food reached the lower benches, it was often simpler, plainer, or reduced. The feast was abundant, but it was abundant unequally, reminding everyone present that rank determined taste as much as it determined privilege in law or land. Yet despite this inequality, the act of sharing a table still mattered. To eat in the same hall as one's lord, to hear the same minstrels, to see the same dishes carried in, was to take part in community, however stratified. The feast, in this sense, bound people together while keeping them apart. It created memory, reinforcing identity within the structure of society. There was also humor and play within this order. Records mention fools or jesters seated deliberately out of place, mocking the system, while also reinforcing it. Their presence highlighted the rigidity of seating by breaking it, reminding everyone that hierarchy was so firm it could even be laughed at. The performance of order allowed for controlled disorder, but only within limits. Archaeological and written evidence both confirm how carefully this was managed. Household ordinances, like those from Edward Ivy's court, detail seating arrangements, the order of serving, and the roles of stewards and servers. Every gesture was prescribed, every place predetermined. Nothing was left to chance. The feast was as much about discipline as it was about indulgence. To imagine the medieval feast is therefore to picture not just food on a table, but people arranged with precision, seated in order, reminded constantly of their place. It was a world of chairs for the few, benches for the many, scraps for the rest. It was hierarchy made visible in wood, bread, and candlelight. And yet, even in this rigid structure, the feast carried a sense of occasion. To sit, to eat, to watch the rituals unfold, was to take part in something larger than the self. Whether at the high table or at the edge of the hall, each person was included in the story being told. The feast was not only about appetite, it was about belonging to a world where every place at the table had meaning, and every seat told a story. If the food and the seating were visible signs of order, the real substance of the medieval feast often lay in what was spoken, agreed upon, or silently understood across the table. A feast was not simply nourishment. It was a theater of politics where power was displayed, affirmed, and sometimes quietly negotiated. To sit at a feast was to be reminded not only of one's appetite, but of one's allegiance. For the lord who hosted the meal, the feast was a demonstration of generosity. To provide food in abundance was to show strength. Scarcity was a constant shadow in the Middle Ages. Harvests could fail, winters could stretch long, and famine was never far away. A noble who could fill tables with meat, bread, and wine proved that he could protect his people from hunger. Generosity was therefore political. It bound retainers, impressed rivals, and reminded peasants of their dependency. Feasting was less about indulgence than about reassurance, about showing that power could sustain. Alliances were often sealed at the table. Marriage negotiations, land agreements, and even peace treaties were discussed over meals. To share bread and salt was symbolic, binding. To drink from the same cup was a sign of trust. Chronicles tell us that kings dined with their barons not just to honor them, but to secure their loyalty. When monarchs traveled, their presence at a feast was both a gift and a demand, for the local lord was expected to provide hospitality on a grand scale. To fail was to risk dishonor, even rebellion. The feast was also a stage for hierarchy within nobility itself. The number of courses served, the quality of the spices used, the presence of exotic dishes, all these reflected status. To host a feast of great magnificence was to stake a claim to influence. Nobles competed with each other in generosity, and the memory of a feast could outlast the taste of the food itself. Guests carried stories of what they had seen to other courts, spreading reputation like currency. Entertainers, too, played a role in this political theater. Minstrels, poets, and heralds praised the host, celebrated victories, and recited genealogies. Their words turned food into narrative, linking the act of dining with the history of the household. A noble's power was reinforced not only in the abundance of his table, but in the stories told about him while guests ate. These performances stitched politics into the very fabric of the meal. But politics at the table was not always harmonious. Feasts could also reveal tensions. Seating arrangements sometimes sparked resentment, as guests judged their rank by proximity to the host. Servants might overhear disputes. Chroniclers note instances where quarrels broke out over precedence, where nobles vied for recognition, where slights at the table escalated into lasting enmities. The feast was orderly on the surface, but beneath it pulsed the rivalries and ambitions of the medieval world. Religion was never far away from politics, and it entered the hall through ritual. Grace was said before meals, blessings given, and fasts observed. To ignore these was to risk scandal. To emphasize them was to claim piety and legitimacy. Kings used feasts on religious holidays to tie their rule to divine favor. Monasteries used communal dining to model obedience and humility, though even here, the abbot's table reminded monks of hierarchy. The language of food itself carried politics. Dishes were named after victories, decorated with heraldic symbols, or presented in elaborate displays that reminded guests of power and wealth. Subtleties, those intricate sugar sculptures popular in later centuries, often depicted castles, saints, or scenes of triumph, turning dessert into propaganda. Even the act of serving was political: who carved, who poured, who tasted first. Every detail reinforced structure. There is a paradox here. The feast seemed to offer abundance, community, and joy, yet it also carried the weight of obligation. Nobles were expected to host generously, but generosity came at immense cost. Household accounts show the strain of repeated feasting, with debts mounting from purchases of wine, meat, and spices. To fail in hospitality was a risk, but to overindulge could ruin fortunes. The feast was thus a balance between appearance and survival, between the need to display power and the limits of resources. When kings and lords dined, they did so under watchful eyes. Chroniclers recorded their actions, guests repeated their words, and rivals judged their generosity. A feast was never private. It was public performance, and politics was its script. For peasants, invited to the margins of these events, the politics of the feast was experienced as dependency. To receive food from the Lord was to acknowledge his authority. To eat in his hall was to accept his protection. For retainers and lesser nobles, attendance meant loyalty reinforced through ritual. For rivals, it meant recognition or humiliation, depending on their seat and their portion. In every case, the feast reminded its participants that food was power, and the table was a throne in disguise. So when we picture a medieval feast, we must remember that it was not just the clatter of cups and the taste of roasted meat. It was the murmur of negotiations, the weight of alliances, the subtle display of dominance. The hall was both dining room and council chamber, both kitchen and stage. Politics was not separate from the feast. Politics was the feast. If food and politics gave the medieval feast its structure, entertainment gave it its rhythm. A feast without performance was incomplete. It was not enough to fill bellies or seal alliances. The feast had to engage the senses, to remind guests that they were not just eating, but participating in something larger, something staged. Rituals gave meaning, and entertainment gave motion, turning the long hours of dining into spectacle. Music was everywhere. Minstrels played lutes, harps, and flutes, weaving melody into the air as guests ate. Drums or tabors added rhythm, while bagpipes carried sound through the hall. Music was more than background noise. It was an active presence, a reminder of festivity, of celebration. Songs might recount heroic deeds, praise the host, or retell stories of saints and kings. The music carried narrative, linking the act of eating to the wider tapestry of memory and legend. Poets and storytellers also had their place. To hear tales during a feast was to be reminded of history, of lineage, of the deeds of one's ancestors. Heralds proclaimed genealogies, connecting the living to the dead, the present feast to the long thread of family honor. Storytelling was entertainment, but it was also education, a reinforcement of the values and loyalties that the feast sought to preserve. More physical entertainments appeared as well. Jugglers, dancers, and acrobats performed between courses. Their movements broke the rhythm of eating, drawing attention, provoking laughter or wonder. Fools and jesters added humor, mocking guests or playfully breaking the order of hierarchy, though always within limits. Their license to jest highlighted the seriousness of the structure around them. By exaggerating disorder, they reinforced the reality of order. Rituals structured the flow of the feast. Hand-washing before and after meals was both practical and symbolic. The procession of dishes, carried in elaborate fashion, signaled importance. Some dishes were announced with ceremony, their presentation itself a performance. Carving meat was not a simple act of division, but an art, executed with elegance and precision before the eyes of the hall. The carver's movements were as much a performance as the music or dance. Grace before meals, blessings during, and prayers after tied the feast to the sacred. Even in the midst of abundance, the church reminded diners of humility, of discipline, of gratitude. The rhythm of feast days and fast days wove religious observance into the very structure of the calendar. To feast was to celebrate, but also to submit to the order of faith. Seasonal rituals shaped the flavor of entertainment. At Christmas, carols and plays might be performed. At Easter, processions and symbolic foods reinforced the sacred themes of resurrection and renewal. Harvest feasts carried their own rituals of thanksgiving, tied to the cycles of the earth. Each celebration was layered with meaning, never detached from the larger rhythms of life. Luxury and theater often mingled. Dishes were sometimes presented in elaborate disguises. A pie might conceal live birds that flew out when cut, creating wonder at the table. Sugar sculptures, called subtleties, were shaped into castles, saints, or animals, marvels of artistry that could be admired before being consumed. Food itself became performance, its presentation as important as its taste. These displays reminded guests of the host's wealth, for such extravagance required resources, time, and skill. The entertainment was not only for delight. It was political, like the feast itself. To provide musicians, poets, or elaborate dishes was to display power and generosity. Guests judged the host by the quality of performance as much as by the quality of food. The more extravagant the entertainment, the greater the impression left on those who attended. Feasts lived on in memory not just because of what was eaten, but because of what was seen, heard, and felt. Ritual even extended to departure. Guests were often given gifts or tokens, remnants of the feast to carry away. These might be leftover food, coins, or symbolic items, reinforcing bonds beyond the hall. The feast ended not with silence, but with gestures that tied the event back into the fabric of community and obligation. If we stand back and look at the feast as a whole, we see that entertainment and ritual were not separate from food and politics. They were threads in the same fabric. To eat was to listen, to watch, to participate in rhythm and symbol. The medieval feast was as much theater as it was dining, and everyone present was both audience and actor. It is tempting to think of these entertainments as diversions, mere distractions to pass the time. But in the Middle Ages, where life was hard, labor constant, and leisure scarce, such moments of shared performance carried profound meaning. They reminded people of joy, of wonder, of the possibility of spectacle in a world often defined by survival. Entertainment was not a luxury. It was a reminder of humanity, stitched into the fabric of ritual. So when we imagine a medieval feast, we must not picture only the food or the hall. We must imagine the music filling the rafters, the laughter at a jester's joke, the solemnity of a prayer, the awe at a sugar sculpture shaped like a castle. The feast was an experience of all the senses, a blending of body and spirit, appetite and imagination. And it was in this blending that its true meaning emerged. Behind the candlelight, the music, and the display of abundance, there was another world. It was the world of kitchens, pantries, and servants, the hidden labor that made the feast possible. The medieval feast, for all its glitter and performance, rested on the backs of countless workers whose names rarely appear in the records. Without them, there would have been no feast at all. The medieval kitchen was not a single room, but a network of spaces. Large households often had separate areas for boiling, roasting, and baking. Fires burned constantly, filling the air with smoke, heat, and the smell of meat. Huge hearths dominated the space, with spits for turning whole animals, cauldrons for stews, and ovens for bread. The work was relentless. Servants rose early to prepare, spent the day chopping, stirring, turning, and kneading, and worked late into the night to clean and store what remained. Cooks held a respected yet demanding role. They needed not only skill, but also knowledge of preservation and spice. Meat had to be salted or smoked to keep it edible, fish dried or pickled, grains carefully measured and stored. Spices, expensive and rare, had to be used sparingly but with enough flourish to impress. To prepare a feast was to balance resources, to stretch what was available while presenting it as abundance. Beneath the cooks were countless assistants. Young boys ran errands, fetched water, carried wood, plucked poultry, and turned spits. Women kneaded bread, stirred pottage, and washed endless pots. Butchers prepared carcasses, bakers tended ovens, brewers managed ale, each craft feeding into the larger whole. The organization was military in its precision. Each person had a task, and every task mattered. Beyond the kitchen, stewards and clerks managed supplies. They kept inventories, purchased goods, and ensured that dishes were served in proper order. They calculated portions, not only to feed guests but to display generosity without exhausting resources. The steward's role was administrative as much as culinary, a reminder that feasting was both hospitality and economics. Serving the meal was a performance in itself. Dishes were carried in procession, presented first to the high table, and then distributed. Servers had to know whom to approach, how to bow, when to step forward. Mistakes could cause embarrassment, and embarrassment at a feast was more than a personal failure. It was a blemish on the host's honor. Training was constant, and service was as ritualized as the carving of meat or the pouring of wine. Even cleaning carried ritual weight. Trenchers of bread, once used as plates, were often given to the poor after the meal, a redistribution that reinforced the host's generosity. Leftovers were collected, scraps fed to dogs or servants. The hall was swept, rushes replaced, benches stacked away. By the next day, the room returned to its ordinary function, the traces of grandeur swept into memory. Labor also extended beyond the household. A grand feast often required contributions from tenants or local villages. Peasants might owe food as part of rent or obligation, delivering chickens, eggs, or grain for their lord's table. Huntsmen provided venison, fishermen their catch, merchants their spices and wine. The feast rippled outward, drawing on networks of labor that stretched far beyond the hall itself. For monasteries and guilds, the labor was communal. Monks worked in kitchens alongside lay brothers, brewing ale, baking bread, or tending gardens. Guild members pooled resources, with apprentices and journeymen preparing food for shared meals. Even here, hierarchy shaped labor, with lower ranks doing the heaviest work while masters reaped the symbolic benefits. It is worth pausing to reflect on this hidden world, because history often forgets it. Chronicles praise the splendor of kings, poets describe the magnificence of lords, but rarely do they mention the boy turning a spit for hours, or the woman scouring pots in smoky kitchens, or the steward counting loaves to ensure enough bread reached the benches. Yet without them, the feast could not exist. Their labor was invisible but essential, their anonymity the price of grandeur. The feast, then, was a paradox. It appeared effortless, a display of abundance and order. Yet it was built on endless labor, on the sweat of servants, on the precise management of resources, on the grinding work of kitchens filled with fire and smoke. What appeared as generosity in the hall was, behind the scenes, relentless toil. To remember the labor is to see the feast more clearly. It was not simply the story of lords and nobles, of power and performance. It was also the story of workers, peasants, cooks, and servants, whose hands made abundance possible. Their names are forgotten, but their labor lingers in every dish, every cup, every memory of a medieval table. And so, the feast becomes not only a reflection of hierarchy and politics, but also of dependence. Those who dined depended on those who labored, even if they did not acknowledge it. The medieval feast was, at its heart, a collaboration, unequal, unspoken, but undeniable. No medieval feast was complete without religion woven through it, for in the Middle Ages the sacred touched every aspect of daily life, and the table was no exception. To eat was not just to satisfy hunger, it was to participate in ritual, to acknowledge divine order, and to frame the act of feasting within the larger story of faith. Every meal began and ended with prayer. Grace was spoken aloud, sometimes chanted, reminding guests that abundance came from God, not merely from the generosity of their host. The words sanctified the food, transforming ordinary bread and meat into blessings. This was not only about gratitude, it was also about legitimacy. A noble's ability to host a feast was framed as proof of divine favor. By giving thanks, the host acknowledged that wealth flowed from God's hand, not just from land or conquest. Feasts were often tied to the liturgical calendar. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, saints' feast days, all brought with them elaborate meals. The rhythm of fasting and feasting defined the year. During Lent, meat was forbidden, and fish became central. At Easter, lamb reappeared, symbolizing Christ's sacrifice. At Christmas, special breads and spiced dishes marked celebration. The feast was never random. It followed the cycles of faith, embedding religion into the very taste of food. Symbolism filled the table. Bread itself carried sacred weight, a reminder of the Eucharist. Salt, precious and carefully stored, was a symbol of preservation and covenant. Meat, especially lamb, spoke of sacrifice. Fish recalled the apostles. Wine, red and flowing, echoed the blood of Christ. To eat these foods was to taste reminders of belief, whether consciously or not. Even the colors of dishes, golden saffron, red pomegranate, green herbs, carried layers of meaning in a world that read symbols everywhere. Some feasts included direct liturgical performances. Priests blessed the tables, choristers sang hymns, relics were displayed in processions through the hall. In monasteries, meals were eaten in silence while scripture was read aloud, binding the act of eating to the discipline of worship. Even in noble courts, the presence of chaplains and clerics ensured that no meal was detached from the sacred. Ritual purification marked the act of dining. Hand-washing before meals was more than hygiene. It was a symbolic cleansing, a reminder of purity before partaking. The shared act of washing bound guests together, much like the shared act of prayer. The hall became, for a time, an echo of the church, ordered, ritualized, filled with meaning. The very structure of the feast mirrored theological order. The high table, elevated above the others, resembled an altar, with the Lord presiding. The procession of dishes resembled a liturgy, with movement, presentation, and blessing. Even the silence that fell before grace echoed the hush of sacred ritual. The feast was both secular and sacred, both worldly and divine. But religion at the feast was not only solemn. It was celebratory. Festivals marked by food were times of joy, of laughter, of release from daily hardship. The sacred and the joyful blended, reminding people that religion was not only about restraint, but also about celebration. The abundance of food was framed as a reflection of divine generosity. To feast well was to honor God, as long as it was done with gratitude and prayer. At the same time, the church warned against excess. Gluttony was a sin, and too much indulgence could be seen as moral weakness. Preachers thundered against nobles who wasted food on display while peasants starved. Satirical poems mocked feasts that seemed more about pride than piety. Even in celebration, there was tension between the sacred call to moderation and the worldly desire for abundance. Yet the tension itself reveals how deeply religion was woven into feasting. Every bite carried moral weight. Every course was shadowed by questions of virtue and vice. To eat too little was ungrateful. To eat too much was sinful. To share was holy. To hoard was corrupt. The table was a stage for moral lessons as much as for appetite. When we picture a medieval feast, we might imagine it as noisy, smoky, filled with laughter and spectacle. And it was. But within that noise, within the clatter of knives and the music of minstrels, lay prayer, symbol, and ritual. The feast was a sermon written in bread and wine, a performance of faith as much as of power. So the next time we imagine trenchers of bread or goblets of wine raised in candlelight, it is worth remembering that these were not only meals. They were sacraments of community, echoes of worship, fragments of the sacred woven into the fabric of daily life. Religion was not separate from feasting. Religion was the heart of it, quiet and constant, beneath the laughter and song. Every tradition, however enduring it may seem, eventually changes. The medieval feast, so central to the rhythms of life in castles, monasteries, and guild halls, was no exception. By the late Middle Ages and into the early modern era, the feast began to transform, shaped by economics, politics, and the quiet but relentless evolution of culture. What once seemed fixed slowly shifted, leaving behind traces rather than continuities. One reason for change was practical. Feasts were costly, and the resources they required grew harder to sustain. As economies developed, cash replaced barter, and obligations shifted. Lords who once demanded food rents from peasants began to collect money instead. With fewer direct supplies flowing into estates, the ability to host large-scale feasts declined. Nobles still dined in style, but the communal abundance of earlier centuries gave way to more private and selective banquets. Urbanization also altered patterns of dining. As towns and cities grew, food production and trade became more commercial. Guilds and civic bodies hosted their own meals, often smaller in scale and more structured by bureaucracy than by tradition. These feasts retained symbolism, but were shaped more by office and institution than by feudal hierarchy. The communal hall of the castle gave way to the council chamber and the merchant's table. Religion, too, influenced transformation. The Reformation challenged old rituals, questioning the symbolism of food, the sanctity of feast days, and the place of ritual in daily life. In Protestant regions, some feast traditions were pared back, their extravagance criticized as superstition or waste. Catholic regions maintained ritual, but even here, Reform reshaped how feasts were celebrated, with a greater emphasis on restraint. Politics further eroded the old feast. As monarchies centralized power, local lords lost some of their role as providers of hospitality. Royal courts absorbed the splendor of feasting, leaving less space for regional magnates to compete. Court banquets grew more elaborate, but they were also more controlled, less communal. The feast became a tool of monarchy, rather than of local lordship, shifting its role from shared abundance to centralized spectacle. At the same time, tastes were changing. New foods entered Europe from abroad: potatoes, maize, tomatoes, chocolate, coffee, tea. Spices, once rare and symbolic of wealth, became more accessible, though still costly. Sugar grew in prominence, shifting the aesthetics of dining. Feasting adapted, but it did so in ways that marked a departure from the medieval world. The banquet of the Renaissance was not the same as the feast of the 13th century. Even architecture played a role. The great communal halls of castles were replaced by more specialized dining rooms. Privacy grew in importance. Meals became occasions for select company rather than whole communities. The open, stratified table of the medieval feast gave way to the intimate dining chamber, where politics and conversation played out on a smaller stage. This decline was not abrupt. For centuries, feasts continued, sometimes echoing old forms, sometimes inventing new ones. But the communal spirit weakened. The poor received less from noble tables, charity became more institutional, and the idea of the feast as a moment of shared abundance faded. Memory of the old rituals lingered, preserved in chronicles, poetry, and scattered records, but the lived experience grew rarer. Still, the feast never vanished entirely. It transformed. Civic banquets, university dinners, guild feasts, and royal spectacles all carried fragments of the medieval tradition into new contexts. The idea of eating together, of marking community through food, survived, even if the form changed. The medieval feast declined, but it also evolved, leaving traces in the banquets of the Renaissance, the balls of the Enlightenment, and even the state dinners of today. To trace this decline is to see not only loss but continuity. The feast as it once was communal, hierarchical, symbolic, belongs to the Middle Ages. But the impulse behind it, the desire to mark power, identity, and community through food, has never disappeared. The medieval feast became history, but its echoes remain every time a table is laid with ceremony, every time a meal becomes more than sustenance. So the story of decline is not a story of ending, but of change. The feast moved from hall to chamber, from lordship to monarchy, from ritual to spectacle. Its meaning shifted, but its presence endured. In this sense, the medieval feast never truly ended. It simply became something else. The medieval feast belongs to another age, but its traces are still with us. When we gather around a table today, at holidays, weddings, or even political banquets, we are touching something of that older tradition. The way we sit, the rituals we follow, the symbolism we rarely question, all of it echoes the patterns set centuries ago. Think of the holiday meal. Families gather, food is abundant, certain dishes appear not for necessity but for meaning. Turkey at Thanksgiving, lamb at Easter, cake at birthdays, each carries a symbolism that goes beyond taste. These echoes are medieval in spirit. They remind us that food can be ritual, that eating together can be a way of binding community, just as it was in the great halls of lords and monasteries. Or consider the formal banquet. State dinners, university halls, military messes. These still carry the shape of hierarchy, of ritual seating, of speeches and toasts. The medieval high table survives in the head table of weddings, the dais of formal halls, the elevated place where the honored sit. Even in modern offices or schools, the arrangement of seating often carries silent echoes of precedence. We may not call it feasting, but the language of order remains. The legacy is also in our language. Words like banquet, feast, festival, all descend from the medieval blending of food and ritual. Even the word hospitality carries medieval weight, recalling obligations between host and guest that shaped politics as much as kindness. To offer food remains one of the most basic acts of welcome, an inheritance of centuries of ritualized generosity. In literature and imagination, the feast remains powerful. We see it in fantasy novels, in films, in plays that conjure medieval halls filled with laughter and meat. These images endure because the feast speaks to something universal, the desire to celebrate, to display, to gather. The Middle Ages may be distant, but the idea of the feast lingers in every story we tell about abundance and community. The legacy is not only celebratory, it is also cautionary. The medieval feast reminds us of inequality, of hierarchy, of the labor that sustained luxury for the few while many lived on scraps. To remember the feast fully is to remember not only the lords at the high table, but also the servants in smoky kitchens, the peasants whose rents supplied the grain, the poor who hoped for leftover bread. The feast is both splendor and shadow, both abundance and dependence. And perhaps that is its deepest legacy. The feast teaches us that food is never just food. It is meaning, it is power, it is community, it is inequality. To study a medieval feast is to see a world in miniature, a society laid bare in bread and salt, wine and meat, prayer and laughter. As we close this story, it is worth imagining the hall once more. The candles are low, the music faded, the guests departed. The rushes on the floor are swept away, the tables cleared, the last dishes stacked. The feast has ended, and yet, in memory it lingers, an echo of abundance, of ritual, of a world that is gone but not forgotten. So wherever you are watching from tonight, your bed, your chair, or some quiet corner, you have shared in that memory. You have walked through the medieval hall, listened to its music, tasted its bread. The story remains, even when the feast is long gone. And with that, thank you for spending this time with Mild History. If you're watching this, let us know where you're tuning in from. It helps us know who gathers at this quiet table. Like and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Stories that are not fast or loud, but steady, calm, and perhaps a little boring in the best way. Because sometimes history is not about drama. Sometimes history is about a feast long past, remembered in silence.